what is the commercial plan. We should focus what value we are bringing. This is solving a specific disease, perfect. But how much it's gonna cost? Is it possible to have a sustainable business production to reach this patient? I'm obsessed actually with the patient getting the solution.
In this episode of LifeSci Continuum, I sit down with Ayse Unsalan to talk about why strong medical device products still fail in the market. We get into the commercialization gap, the danger of siloed teams, and why clinical value is not enough to drive adoption.
Value proposition is what we have to manage, and if I end up with lack of evidence, this is the biggest pain, not having the evidence to position the product in the market.
If you're building, launching, or leading a medical device product team, this episode gets into the stuff that makes or breaks success.
Looking at the problem, you can tell why you are building this product. I used to tell the engineers, I don't necessarily care. What matters is there is a disease, and this is what we are trying to solve. But if you bring an additional competitive edge, right, a unique value proposition, it might offer some additional value.
All right, let's go. Ayse, thanks for joining me today. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
So I'm excited to talk to you about commercialization. Your background is in global commercialization and product leadership. For the listeners and viewers, give us a little bit of your background and some of the experience that led you here today.
Yeah, I have a quite long background in medical device, like quite close to 20 years, I would say, across the different regions. Started in the country, moved to cluster, moved to region, moved to global, and across downstream and upstream marketing roles, so that I gained kind of 360-degree view of the marketing and business.
Your background, you've worked at Getinge, you're now at Olympus. What areas do you think you've been closest to? Portfolio launches, evidence, strategy, pricing?
All of them, but if you ask what was most interesting and most challenging, I would say it was portfolio strategy in general, and also the business cases, because we have a big liability to build the business cases and provide a strong forecast.
What part of that work do you find the most enjoyable, do you think?
Enjoyable, I would say most of it, but maybe more the research part, where you bring more market intelligence, where you bring more analytical skills on the table. I find it's more interesting and also most challenging.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about commercialization, and working with different groups and silos actually within organizations. With your background and experience, in vascular, endovascular work and therapy, what is the common pattern that you see, with product wins versus products stalling out?
I wouldn't describe it as a successful product or stalling product, but the successful teams behind the products. And these teams have usually a common aspect, which is looking at the problem rather than looking at the solution. And on top of this, timing is important. And these teams, I believe they are more mindful about the timing, when to launch, and being mindful about the go-to-market timing strategies. Those are quite crucial to be successful. What I have seen especially in the endovascular field last decade.
So thinking about that, one of the threads there is taking a problem-first approach rather than being super hyper-focused on, I built a great product. I'm going to spend a lot of time just focused on the success of the product and being more customer-centric and solution-centric.
Yes, because looking at the problem, you can tell why you are building this product, right? The product solutions they exist because there is a problem exists, right? So that's why there are different ways to solve a problem. So I used to tell the engineers, okay, I don't necessarily care if you are going to bring me a tube, right? So it might be completely different product. What matters is there is a disease, and this is what we are trying to solve, right? So we are trying to help to treat.
You talked a little bit about working in a big matrix organization. I imagine that commercialization in that environment is even more challenging than, like a startup that's focused on, it's a small team. They have, one or two, a handful of products. What is it like? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, startups, I believe they have their own challenges because usually they even don't have a commercialization team and approach, right? So, but in the big metrics organizations, commercialization is crucial. It's in the heart of the organization, but sometimes we are left in silos, right? So, and we find ourselves just inheriting the decisions we were not necessarily involved. So I think the biggest challenge in the matrix organization is to manage removing the silos and managing these teams coming together and working in a cross-functional team manner. I see it in different organizations. I see this has been a big challenge.
In an organization like that, what do the silos look like? What's been your experience there?
There are several silos. How it looks like is, let's say, if it's about a product launch, what commercialization needs is mainly the timing, right? So everything, the timing is like in the beginning, I said successful teams are very mindful about the time. And if we are left alone, not knowing whatever is delayed, this is one of the very major silo, right? So if we don't know what is really happening in the kitchen, so you can just think about a restaurant, how we operate. So if the chef is not going to cook on time, all these orders, so then the service, the waiter in the service will have a challenge, right? So we are the customer facing teams, right? So as the commercialization, and this is kind of putting us in big troubles and also the reputation of the company moving forward.
Have you had an experience where this is sort of broken down that you could share?
I think it's very common because in medtech, it's inevitable having the delays, right? So there are a lot of components in a product launch, not necessarily launch, even in a commercial product, right? So there are things happening in different functions and we may not be aligned, right? So, and we need to have a common strategy because in the end, the purpose is the same, right? So we have sales targets we have to achieve for the company to successful. And regardless they are commercial or not, they will be getting the rewards based on the commercial success. So this is, I think, the way to break the silos in a way is bringing these teams, understanding what is the ultimate purpose and what is the commercial plan. And when the teams really understands, not necessarily overarching values of the company like saving lives, etc., right? So what we are trying to achieve, how we will be successful to help the customers to save lives.
What I'm wondering from you is, in a matrix organization or larger organization, do you see there are particular groups or silos that always blow up the budget?
I wouldn't say particular groups. I think this applies to all groups. In a way, we focus on what we're supposed to deliver. Let's say R&D has their data timelines. We have our commercial targets. Like, in a way, the corporate sets the targets, individual functional targets, right? Everyone is kind of rushing to hit their targets. Like, that's why I mentioned, like, the way to break might be like really embracing the same targets. But one example, let's say we are working in a product development, and in a development, you cannot just target and let the scientific affairs team or the design a trial, right? So if they work in a silo to design a trial, at the end, the commercial team will end up with the launch with some evidence which may not necessarily fit what we want to claim, right? So what is going to help us to sell a product is bringing some values to customers. And to build these values, we need to be involved in the early stages of clinical trial design, right? This is an example. When these teams work in silos, they don't belong into the same team. We need to kind of seamlessly integrate to each other. It's kind of difficult and many organizations struggle. And we are also trying to find solutions, right? Constantly building cross-functional team, building agile teams. But I would say it is not intentional because in a way we have a tendency to focus on what is tasked to us, right? So what our function exists for. Yeah. This is kind of a natural tendency, I would say, but there are ways to break, and it's also a matter of education, like bringing this cross-functional team together, working for one single purpose. It's not easy, but it is the ideal word.
So with those challenges in mind, what have you seen work? What are some, whether they're big overarching changes or just kind of small interpersonal things, what have you seen work to bring those teams closer together?
Actually, I have a great example. When I was hired for a senior product management position in the US, I thought I was the right candidate. I was pulled kind of for this position because I was bringing some clinical intelligence, right? So from the clinical partner's perspective. But interestingly, I was interviewed by a cross-functional team, including the R&D. And the first thing the R&D interviewer told me was, you have to be my best friend if you want this job, right? So I think this was a very visionary approach, right? So to hire a marketer in a product development team, product strategy, portfolio strategy team, because we are kind of inseparable, right? So the commercial part, marketer part, and the R&D part, and the clinical part supposed to come together. And in some organizations, we may not have the doctors, but we have the consultants, right? So to select which consultants gonna fit for the specific project, it's also a market intelligence. So this is what we bring to these projects. And I think this was a kind of first time I experienced, and I think this is a very visionary way to bring the teams together, because I believe the success is also related within these teams, bringing like technical, clinical, commercial, savvy people together, but in a team where people trust and respect each other. I think trust and respect, that's why even in a hiring process, involving this cross-functional interview was kind of very interesting and successful decision, I would say.
You had mentioned too, when working in silos, commercial teams can be treated kind of as the last mile service versus being a strategic partner, in that you're not always involved in the strategy early on. And so you end up inheriting decisions that you didn't help define. Talk about that a little bit.
In a way, the understanding about the commercialization is we are in charge of commercialization of the product, to sell the product, right? Mm-hmm. So to promote the product. But how we will achieve this? Like if you give me a product just because it's a nice screen, how I'm gonna sell this? This requires for us to be successful in the commercial side. This requires to have some involvement in the earlier decisions, right? So which includes the product requirement. What kind of product is required, right? So, mm-hmm. And we also have a mindset to look around us, not like, because this is about the vision you have. If you are sitting in a lab, you can be the best scientist to develop the best product, right? So, but then you need a peripheral vision, you need a wider vision to understand what is happening in the market, because mm-hmm. I don't believe we are looking for the best technology, right? So always. Of course, best technology is desired, but what I try to say, best technology may not work, may not fit to the reality of the market, right? So we need to understand what market looks for, and then how market will evolve, right? So which players will be in there, right? So this market research is not easy. We can spend millions to the consultants, research companies, but we all know it is not the final. This is our expectations, forecasts. We are utilizing our acumen to validate some research right after paying millions to this research. So this requires a holistic view, right? So I think when you merge these teams earlier rather than late, like during the commercialization, if you bring this intelligence earlier, you can develop maybe the right product for the market, considering the timelines, because in MedTech, we are also looking up to 10 years sometimes, right? So to commercialize a product, from the day you start a project, it might take 10 years, right? Depends on the product, obviously, but it's a long journey.
Right. And I think you make a good point. Not many companies have millions of dollars to spend on market research. However, they can do things, at a smaller scale. But I think the important takeaway, too, is that you actually do your due diligence. You look at what's happening in the market, whether you have, $1,000 or millions of dollars. You need to do the work.
I might have exaggerated with the millions, but I think like even spending a couple of hundreds for a big medtech, it's a big pocket, right, in your marketing budget. But still, you will not get the perfect answer, right? So that's why it requires a multi-functional effort to bring the right forecast. That's why I said in the beginning, for me, most interesting and most challenging part was the dignity of a business case, because we are liable. We are providing a forecast looking ahead minimum 20 years. Right? Yeah. So because you are preparing a 10 years forecast, if the product will be launched 10 years later, you have to guess what's going to happen in 20 years, which products will be, which therapies will be in the market, right? And not necessarily population-wise, right? So it might be easy to guess the aging population, which diseases will be, but this is also hard because we don't know which kind of solutions will come to some major diseases, right? So this is always a bet, and we have to have the best bet in this forecast and the business case.
The things I like to stress with my clients who often, they have a product that they've created, it's their baby, they love it, and they just want to market it. But they don't want to necessarily invest in market intelligence and looking at those projections and what the future might look like. They just want to move. So I appreciate the idea of doing your due diligence and owning that projection. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Actually, we all love our babies, right? Either ugly or beautiful. I call it like falling in love, or even not falling in love. Maybe it's very strong, like product infatuation, right? So we have a emotional connection, either as a startup, I see with the startups as well, but even with the mature products, then we have a great solution, great product, which is also acknowledged by the societies, then you have such a confidence in your product, and it even strengthens this infatuation. But I see this might become a trap, right? So moving forward, it might just blind you what is happening around, right? So we need to still continue to look around what is next.
Let's go back for a moment, though. Tell me a little bit more about inheriting decisions that maybe you didn't have a chance to shape. What have you seen there? How does that manifest?
There are so many examples, but one just pops in my mind. It's the willingness to pay, right? So this is how you one of the essential pillars of a business case. So you assume an ASP, expect, average selling price based on the research you have done about the willingness to pay. This may not be the reality when you come to the commercialization phase, right? So, and I have examples that we face with the fact that this business cases turn negative, right? So then you cannot prove the return of investment or even the forecast. But these decisions have been made, and these assumptions, based on these assumptions, we end up inheriting a decision based on X ASP, but this X may not be the reality, and then the business case will not realize because we cannot achieve the expected forecast, maybe targets.
You're inheriting decisions, right? Somebody else before you or earlier in the chain, however you got there, made a decision, and now you're responsible for the outcomes. I think I would struggle to support that if you hadn't been part of the decision-making process and the strategy.
Yeah, another example, strong one actually. So you are developing a product and you go through the approval process, but you might end up with the wrong indication. If you don't have the real market's voice and understanding of what market needs, I was in a position trying to sell a product without an indication. So which means your hands are completely tied. You can't do. So this is a decision taken maybe 5-10 years ago before you start the trial phase, right? So before, I don't mean filing the FDA for the FDA or the CE mark, but it starts when you start designing your trial. That's why it's kind of, I keep bringing up, this involvement requires the start from the day one.
Right. I was listening to that and thinking through with a company that I worked with years and years ago. We did some voice of customer work, and customers wanted the company to expand the application of this particular product to, to different markets. The company, though, was infatuated with developing a solution that would put it in line with a competitor and make it very, direct one-to-one competition. And as a small company that has a unique solution that nobody else has, a unique technology, and the market, the customer is asking specifically for you to expand this to other areas, and you ignore that and instead basically try to turn your product into a Me Too product. And then you're responsible for the growth of that product line, and the market doesn't want it because they already have a solution that does that.
On top of it, you are eroding the value of the previous product, right? So because you are causing this product becomes a commodity. But if you bring an additional competitive edge, right, a unique value proposition, it can be a feature, right, a basic feature, it might change the offer some additional value, right? Either an operational value or a clinical value, right, to the customers. Not necessarily. Sometimes we also stuck like what value we want to bring. Value is not necessarily clinical value, right? So we have to think who we are trying to relate ourselves.
I mean, what do you wish product teams understood really better about the difference between clinical value and market adoption?
Yeah, very simple way to say clinical value is just your permission to enter a room, but adoption means it's the permission to stay in the room, right? So this is the room, I mean the market, right? So access to market, if with the R&Ds, like in the beginning of the projects, at least the R&D teams are focusing from different perspective how we will access the market, right? So first, how we will make this approved and the market access. But access is not enough for the adoption, right? So because you're supposed to stay in this market for this project to become real, right? Because I also want to say it is a scientific project, right? So, and art can be for art's sake, but science is for humanity. And at the end, you are not bringing anything to humanity if you are not staying in the market.
I see this quite a bit with smaller companies, particularly clinicians who have seen a problem in practice and they decide to solve the problem. They develop a product, and they expect that people will simply just buy it because they solve the problem. And I think one of the things you and I have talked about before is that you're not just selling that product to other people just like you. You're selling your product into a system, and you need the people within that system to adopt, to not create friction and not block that product from being adopted into, whether it's the healthcare system, a specific hospital.
Reimbursement.
Yeah. Do you want to weigh in on that?
Actually, I want to just reinforce what you said. I think like I find myself and my colleagues, we are like a privileged group of people because we are working with super intelligent people, right? So including the clinicians and R&D people, right? So I feel myself, I'm super privileged, finding myself sitting together with most esteemed surgeon in the world and brilliant engineer working together, right? So I think in a way, this also clouds some judgment because these people are really extremely intelligent and visionary sometimes, right? And they see there is a problem and they have a solution. But these solutions, like we discussed, may not have a place in the market. So we have to make sure, because those are expensive long-term projects. And this is important. We are contributing in the science and the humanity. This is how I see my role in the society, right? And my function is to make sure this is going to work. If it's not going to work, there might be ways to pivot the same project, right? So the idea not necessarily needs to be killed, but if we bring the commercial intelligence to these kind of projects, then we might help these bright people, right? So to pivot and make sure there will be commercial success, because if there is no commercial success, there is no need to have an invention, even though it is a breakthrough. This is how I see it.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. You said something interesting, and you said sometimes there's not a place in the market for this. Can you explain that?
There might be so many reasons. We need to focus what value we are bringing. Okay, this is solving a specific disease, right? So perfect. But how much it's going to cost? Is it possible to have a sustainable business production to reach this patient? Because in the end, this product, once upon a time was a prototype, becomes a product, gets the FDA, but still needs to reach the patient. And the financial, obviously, barriers are quite high. So if we don't reach to some threshold to achieve the economies of scale, so it is really hard to run this business. And that's why I keep talking about commercial success. It's not like an obsession about commercial success. I'm obsessed actually with the patient getting the solution, right? So, but I have to think how the patient will get this solution, because there are brilliant solutions out there, because I have been also involved in many, investigations of little startups during M&A processes. And it's amazed me. It amazed me because there are brilliant ideas, but we have to make sure this is feasible, right? The idea needs to bring a clinical value, operational value, and financial value. We cannot just stuck to the clinical value, unfortunately, because it's all together. If a product is working, bringing a value, but physician may not prefer to use it because it might be super cumbersome. Right? So the handling may not be good enough, and the physician might prefer to go to good enough alternative rather than a perfect solution clinical wise for the patient, right? For the end patient. But if you don't address the needs of the operator, then your product still fails. There are different questions we asked before we start this prototype.
You make a really great point in that a lot of companies in some different markets are looking at, they've developed the very best. We have the very best, most highly engineered solution out there. And we are going to bank the commercial success of this on the engineering of the solution, when that high level of engineering is not what the market is looking for. And the market can succeed, and accomplish whatever they're trying to do in treating a patient with a good enough solution. I think that point can't be said enough, because from my perspective, more downstream, a lot of times the market doesn't care about perfect. They have to balance these variables, and a good enough solution can often win when it checks more of the boxes along the way.
And most importantly, while we define good enough, it doesn't mean it's not safe, because safety is the baseline in medtech. So you have to prove the safety regardless. Good enough means it may not be the perfectly desired by because we also listen a lot to customers during this process, and sometimes I believe this also leads us to wrong directions. I'm going back to the timing. Sometimes making the right decision, right time, trying to make it perfect, which will take you 15 years later to the market, this may not be the best solution, right? So we have to look again from the business lenses, and what is the ideal? Can we make the iterations to make it close to perfect in the next steps, right? So because features can be always improved, but timing to the market also matters a lot, right? So that's why I see the teams, I experienced that personally, trying to make the product perfect, and we are delayed, right? And back to the solution, sometimes there are different ways just to make it shorter to the market time. To shorten the market time, you might even pivot the complete project, right? Because there are some products, I have a lot of experience obviously with implants, and implant compared to non-implant, the time to market, there is a significant difference. Maybe we are talking maybe 5 years difference, right? Bringing an implant to the market, it takes 8 to 10 years, right? But if you have a tweak and a solution, rather than changing the implant, you can change maybe the delivery mechanism of the product, and you can just provide similar benefit, because this is not about your product. Again, it's about what customer needs, what the problem is, what you are trying to solve. If you focus on the problem, you are not going to obsess with the best product, but you will be obsessed with solving the problem, and then you might come up with a shortcut solution. And I experienced that. They were quite successful, and I was in the part of the failure, unfortunately.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, actually, the story is I was in a team trying to make the perfect product. That's why I genuinely share my experience, because I was there. And this was a wrong decision because we were late to market while our main competitor pivoted the project and came up with a solution which was not an implant, but was addressing exactly the same customer need, right? So at the end, I learned in a very hard way.
You know, going back, time travel a little bit, what do you think you would coach yourself back then to do if you knew what you knew now? What would you do differently?
I would go back to my cross-functional team and do this exercise. What is the problem? What are the alternatives? Which competitors that we can see, right? So are working on which projects? So then what are their possible go-to-market times and what are our targets, right? So if there is a gap, it is no-brainer. You need to change your strategy. So I would love to go back and do this exercise with our cross-functional team to pivot this project. It's important to talk about our failures, but we prefer to bury our failures. The best way to learn is the failures. So that's why I'm super passionate about this topic now, because we need to learn from our failures. Failing it's okay, but we should not fail next time, right? So I just want to really help people, not for them not to fail like I did.
Yeah, I mean, we try not to fail, but when we do, as long as we learn from it and we don't do the same thing again, it's really for the best. Have you ever been pulled into a program where you felt like it was too late and you were kind of locked into a situation where it was going to be really hard to succeed or win?
Many times, right? So because let's say I was in charge of mature products, right? So in that case, you were never a decision maker how this product will be designed. But then my position was obviously based on the market conditions to reposition the product, right? So based on what is coming, what you have, repositioning the existing mature product was the solution. But we are always late with some decisions, right? It depends on when you enter to an organization, when you take a responsibility, right? You will be always late. And there will be a need to push the limits to find a solution. Because there are solutions, even you end up with product with very little evidence, right? So then you are going to push for the evidence, bringing the evidence in the shortest terms. That would be the focus. But I would say, I think commercial teams, usually we are always late in the decisions, or we inherit the products.
Why do you think it's just how it is? Why do you think that's a rule?
Again, it's back to the silos, because in general, R&D teams and the commercial teams are not together, right? So there are different ways to work together. But if we look at the startups, I don't see a commercial partner when I look at the startups. I meet people, brilliant people, an engineer married with a cardiologist. They have a bright product, right? So and they want to sell this product to some incumbents, right? Perfect. It's really inspiring what they are trying to do. But the basic questions I'm asking as a commercial partner, they have no clue, right? So they don't answer what these incumbents, potential buyers, potential founders will be asking to them. So in a way, I see startups have the biggest problem because they usually don't have these partners. They don't see this necessity. They don't understand they don't see the necessity, because I see it's like an iceberg, right? So, and when we look at the researchers, like 75 to 90% of the prototypes never see a patient, right? So there are like, some of them must be really breakthroughs, right? So, and I have been in the industry for quite long time, and when I look at all the startups I have investigated, some of them acquired by big medtech, they were not necessarily successful. Some of them were really successful, right? So I keep an eye on all these startups that I have investigated all my life. And I also, like, look at the new startups, because in a way we have to look at the startups to foresee the indirect threats, right? So in a way, looking at startups, it's inevitable for us, and that's why it's kind of my hobby interest, let me say. And I see, when I talk to them, they don't have a commercial savviness in general. But when we look at the organizations like I do work, right? So big matrix organizations, this is about the setup. This is about the silos, like, in a way. Also, in the same organization, I work very closely with R&D, or in the same company, I may not have the same experience, because it's about the time periods, it's about who is managing these teams, right? So then the personalities come to the picture, and I think we are just creating silos and not making it work. It's organizations are like humans. From the behavioral perspective, we are like, however we behave in our life, however we act, organizations are exactly like humans.
Yeah, we are humans, and you're right.
Yeah, because they consist of humans, right? So, but the reactions, right? So we call them Apple, right? We call them Netflix. It's a brand, it's a company, but I see the way they behave, or a medtech company, like a human.
Very
We
much so.
fail. We have our own egos. We have our own emotions. We have our own inner fights, and these are kind of clouding our judgments.
There's a whole science around, the human element, the behavioral parts of organizations, and getting
Yes.
them, just trying to get people rowing in the right direction, or in the same direction, I would say.
And there are a lot of efforts, especially in the corporate world, right, to make it work. And there are times it works, it doesn't, because it's all human dependent, right? So it's all about us. And I still believe, if we can build the trust within these teams, and respect and trust, these are like coming together, and then things are working pretty well, and these products become successful in the market.
Sort of following up on the line of thought about being pulled into programs maybe later than you would like, or too late. What are some examples of some things that you've seen that have been locked in place that have made your job harder?
Indication, price, market assumptions, and the value propositions, right? The value proposition we also inherit initially, especially at the time of the launch, right? And it may not be real value which will sell. It might be missing. And I think marketing is about, not necessarily, I can call like, okay, we are managing the product life cycle, but we are managing the value proposition throughout the product life cycle, right? So at the time of the launch, you have a value proposition during the maturity, based on the evidence you generate, based on the therapy changes, competition. You constantly maintain this value, right? So, and value proposition is what we have to manage. And if I end up with lack of evidence, this is the biggest pain, I would say, for a marketer, not having the evidence to position the product in the market. And this evidence is not necessarily clinical, right? So operational, financial, these three elements, these three pillars needs to be well taught for the successful commercialization.
That is a lot that you can get pulled into too late to move.
There is a lot, there is not like a single example.
Yeah.
If I keep thinking, most probably I will bring like tens of examples, but like very high level, I would say, because from the marketing perspective, very high level is the value proposition, evidence, willingness to pay. Those are like the crucials, because these are the main pillars letting us to be successful or not.
One area that I focus on quite a bit is value creation. Like, what are we delivering to the market that's of value, and preferably unique value? There isn't
unique value.
I don't think very many of us like to work on a Me Too product. And so,
not fun, at least.
Well,
it's
yeah,
not fun.
exactly. And I don't think I don't think most people sit down and say, okay, hey, we should build another one of those. And be that. People, I think a lot of people want to and are focused on solving real problems. And so, interpreting and developing a value creation is easier in those situations where there's that intention early on to deliver value to the market, not I have an idea for a thing and I'll just make that and expect that the market will just adopt it. And so this idea of like just making a better product, that's ill-defined. It's not really a strategy. And it sounds like you're an advocate, shocker, that commercialization, that marketing should be part of the conversation very early on.
Indeed.
What has been your experience as far as the kind of the differences and the challenges there in working with people who are very feature focused as opposed to being market or needs focused?
Feature focus, it's like a tendency in MedTech, right? So in general, even the marketeers' language is like about the features, right? So because this is what our customers really understand, right? They are scientists and they want us to be explicit, right? So we have a tendency to talk about features. It's, I think, across the board, not necessarily starting with R&D. And there is an explanation because this is what customer wants. I don't necessarily agree, because in the end, what is in it for the customer? This is how we define the value proposition, why the product matters or why this feature matters for this customer, right? So this is the mindset I want to reach, right? So, and it is hard, I challenge myself every day whenever I have a new product. It's quite challenging, right? This is an exercise, and it's like, and especially when you stuck like with the features, and especially if you have really a good product, right? So you kind of have this feeling that how like you are good, right? So knowing that this is good, it's also blinding you in a way, because it's kind of a superiority feeling, right? So, and you are looking at the market, I'm the best. And I am by far the best, right? And I can bring that. This is making us kind of proud and kind of blinding all of us. So it's called institutional blindness, right? So we teach about this in the schools and we train people. But when we come to the workshops, when we come to our own projects, it's hard to open this mind, right? So I several times try to bring externals, suggest bringing externals to open our minds, because I get blinded too, because I believe this product is by far the best, right? And we are in a way inspired by the physicians to create this product with these features, right?
We fall in love with our products, like our solution. We spent the time, sometimes years going through this journey and developing a solution to a problem or a product. And, as we go about that, we get locked in. We get really invested. We become proud of it. It is our baby. And it's easy to close out inputs that might fundamentally change what your product is, because this is yours. You made it. And no one is going to tell you to change it or make it differently. And for I think larger organizations, it makes that thinking in some of the different silos can make pivots harder. Responding to some of the commercialization components that you talked about earlier. When you get new data in that says that maybe you need to move this thing a different way, some of that blindness you talk about can make it hard to make those adjustments.
harder or sometimes unnecessary, right? Because it's also a perception. As the company, as these all individuals across the company, we believe it's not necessary, right? So when you are so proud, when you are so obsessed with this success, you are blinded in a way. You don't see what is necessary, what might be coming, because right now everything might be peaceful, good, but like we constantly have this vision, like looking forward, right? So we have to constantly look next minimum 10 years, right? Depends on the product life cycle. It might be longer, shorter, but you have to, in average, look at 10 years. And if you're stuck with these features that you are really proud, you may not see what might be coming. That's also kind of a threat. It's kind of a trap. So you might enjoy for a while being the best, having a great solution, but in a way, sometimes it might be your enemy throughout the product life cycle.
Just briefly, how do you define relevance in the space? Who needs to find you relevant and why?
Relevance in MedTech has layers, right? So I focus on the stakeholders. Who are our stakeholders? We need to be relevant to the patient clinically. We need to be relevant to our stakeholders financially or founders. We need to be relevant to the customers financially, operationally, clinically, and also we need to be relevant to our employees, right? Co-workers. So in many ways from the values perspective. So relevance has several layers. It's all about bringing the value to all the stakeholders we are touching, we have any kind of impact on.
And I think we could dig into that more in another episode.
I would love to.
It was great to have you on today. Thank you for joining me, and hopefully we'll hear from you again, but have a great night.
Thank you. Likewise. See you soon.
If you made it here, thank you. If you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you want to learn more about this topic, I expand on it below, as well as in my LinkedIn newsletter. That's all for now. More soon.